very good evening in Singapore to everyone and morning to the rest of the world out there in the US. Thank you for joining us for the Institute of South Asian Studies book discussion on imperialism and the developing world and how Britain and the United States shaped the global periphery. Before we proceed with the event proper, I would appreciate if you could mute your microphones throughout the session. Thank you. And this afternoon, we are very honored to have with us the distinguished author of the book, Professor Atul Kohli, who is David K. Ebro's Professor of International Affairs and Professor of Politics at Princeton University. I shall now hand over the session to the moderator, ISA's Visiting Research Fellow, Diego Mariana, to take you forward. Over to you, Diego.
Thank you, Sitara, and good evening or good morning or afternoon or good night, depending on where you are, and a very well welcome from the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. We have a rather large and growing audience coming from both coasts in the US, Europe, South Asia, China, Singapore, of course, Southeast Asia, Australia, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a few other places. So a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Diego Majorano, and I am very happy to host Professor Atul Kohli to discuss his latest book, Imperialism and the Developing World, How Britain and the United States Shaped the Global Periphery, published by Oxford University Press. I cannot show the cover of the book because I read it on my Kindle, but perhaps Rani can. But first of all, thank you very much, Professor Kohli, to be with us today. And Professor Kohli is one of those who, for real, doesn't need much of an introduction, and he is one of the most influential scholars of the last few decades across a wide range of disciplines, from political science to development studies to economics. And his research has focused on the political economy of developing countries, and he has published way too many things for me to list them all here. But I cannot not mention at least one highly influential book for me personally and for, again, a wide range of scholars across disciplines. The book was published in 2004, State-Directed Development, Political Power and Industrialization in the Global Periphery. And it explored the crucial role that the state plays in promoting or constraining economic development. And I mentioned this book not only because it's an important book in general, but also because in some ways is a precursor of the one that we are discussing today, which answers three important questions. Why do imperialists imperialize? How they do it, and with what consequences on both the imperial and the imperialized country. I will not say anything more, as Professor Kohli will do a much better job in a few minutes than what I could ever possibly do. But let me just briefly introduce my two colleagues who will discuss Professor Kohli's book with me. Dr. Rani Mullen, who is Associate Professor of Government at the College of William and Mary in the US, and also visiting Senior Research Fellow here at the Institute. And Dr. Kartik Nachiappan, who is a Research Fellow here at ISAS as well. So today's discussion will start with Professor Kohli briefly introducing the book for about 10 minutes, and then Rani and I will pose some questions to him for about 30-35 minutes or so. And this should leave us with 45 minutes for Q&A from the audience. You are welcome to submit your questions through the chat function, and you can do that at any time during the talk. And Kartik will collect and assemble this question, and then we'll pose them to Professor Kohli. Remember to leave your mic and video disabled. And so without further ado, join me in welcoming once again Professor Kohli, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Diego. Thanks for your generosity and your comments. I appreciate that. I'll take about 10 minutes to introduce the book and then focus on questions you and Rani raise and answer them, and we can all get into a dialogue, because a monologue can get rather tedious. So for the next 10 minutes, let me just give you a flavor of this new book that has been published recently. This book on imperialism and the developing world is a study, if you like, of both causes and consequences, all right? Both of causes and consequences of modern imperialism. The focus of the book is on British imperialism in the 19th century and American imperialism in the 20th century, and the dynamics of both formal and informal imperialism are analyzed. Next slide, please, Diego. Thank you. So just focus on this table of contents for the book for a minute to give you a sense of the book. It's a long book. That's the first thing to notice. It's about 540 pages, which was about a 700-page manuscript. It begins with the East India Company in the 18th century onwards, and it ends with American intervention in Iraq, which is still continuing. So it has a historical sweep, for better or for worse. The first half of the book, as you can notice in the table of contents, is on British imperialism, and the second half of the book, as you can again notice, is on American imperialism. Now, let me sort of move beyond just the table of contents and give you a flavor of the book by summarizing first my argument for causes, second, my argument for impact, and then some comparative insight. And that will take me 7 or 8 minutes to do those three things, and then we can open up for discussion. Next slide, please, Diego. Thank you. So one theme that runs consistently throughout the 540 pages is, why did imperialists imperialize? What were the causes? As those who are students or specialists in this field know well, the debates in this area are a legion. They have been debated over and over again, such questions. Marxists, liberals, realists all have developed their arguments on and on. So let me just give you a flavor of my own argument. So I argue in the book that the taproot of imperialism, many of you will recognize that phrase taproot comes from Schumpeter. The taproot of imperialism is the desire of hegemonic powers to enhance their national economic prosperity. So that's really the heart of the argument of what drives imperialism. Then I suggest imperialists imperialize by undermining sovereignty in peripheral countries and by establishing open economic access. So that's the main mechanism. So the key intuition that's driving the book is that national economic prosperity is both an end in itself and a means to power. And in this sense, in my book at least, imperialism is both an economic and a political phenomenon. So if you're a specialist in this area, you will recognize that this is an argument which is in dialogue with both realism and Marxism. So it's neither realist nor Marxist. It's attempting to marry those two, but in the sort of process also trying to transcend them. So that's the argument on causes of imperialism. Next slide, please, Diego.
Yes.
Thank you. So if one theme that runs throughout the book is causes, the other theme that runs throughout the book is the impact of imperialism. Here again, let me just summarize my argument fairly quickly. I argue throughout the book that the impact on the countries of the periphery tends to be negative. And if you like, the central argument, therefore, is that in a world of states, national sovereignty is an economic asset. If you think about it for a minute, it's against globalization type of worldview. It is emphasizing importance of sovereignty. And I suggest that since imperialism seeks to limit the exercise of sovereign power by subject people, there tends to be an inverse relationship between imperialism and development. In other words, the less control a state has over its own affairs, the less likely it is that the people of that state will experience steady, inclusive economic progress. I think I'm able to demonstrate in the book, not perfectly, but reasonably well, that you can trace a varying impact from degree of control from external powers and development prospect inside, moving from formal control being the most detrimental for developmental prospects, informal somewhere in between, and to really get inclusive development, you need sovereign and effective states, which, for those of you who know my work, ties well with the book that Diego mentioned at the beginning. So in a sense, the two books can be read as two volumes, sort of one focusing on imperialism and other on where do effective states come from. That needs to be qualified at the outset, this main suggestion I have made, that national sovereignty is important, but it may not be fully sufficient. It's necessary condition. That's the argument. And once again, this argument is in dialogue with both dependency arguments and pro-globalization standpoints. I make that point for other scholars of this subject who may wonder, who am I arguing with? Usually you can tell a book by who is the enemy in the book, who you're arguing against. And in this book on the causes, it's in dialogue with both dependency and pro-globalization trade and investment theories in the literature. The last slide, please, Diego. All right, so that's basically the heart of the general argument of the book. That is to say, the argument about causes and consequences. I have already summarized that for you. But since it's a very long book with enormous number of cases, sort of a variety of sub-insights emerge from comparing one type of imperialism to another, and sort of there are a lot of moving parts, not all of which I can of course summarize in a 10-minute introduction, but I picked out 3 comparative insights. Just I like those 3 insights, if you like, which I think are worth sort of introducing at the outset, that run throughout the book. And these insights are less generalizing about all the cases. That's where the causes and consequences, which I have finished summarizing. These are contrasts and comparisons of cases. So the first point I would make is that emerges when you juxtapose British imperialism to American imperialism. And I argue what's different about the 2 cases is that Britain really needed an empire, versus the United States has wanted an empire. US has been a giant continental economy. It never really needed an empire in the same way, but for a variety of historical reasons discussed in the book, it ended up wanting one. And this distinction between need and want is more than just semantic. It turns out to be quite consequential. For example, just as one important consequence that flows from that distinction is throughout the 19th century, you see very little dissensus or disagreement within Britain, whether it should be an imperial power or not. Britain needed an empire, and British elite pretty well agreed that it's good for Britain to be an empire. Unlike Britain, the United States has always disagreed about how much empire it needs. It's always been a controversial subject, and that comes from the fact that it doesn't really need it as much as it wants it. And once you just want it, that's a whole different degree of desire. And as a result, people can disagree on how much you should want. And so we notice American imperialism is a really contested set of actions, whereas for Britain, it followed sort of quite consensually. So that's one type of insight. 2 other similar sort of comparative insight. One emerges from juxtaposing formal and informal empire. Again, if you're a specialist, you will recognize these terms come from Gallagher and Robinson. They had argued, especially with reference to Britain, is that Britain preferred an informal empire rather than formal colonialism, especially with the rise of capitalism, say post-Corn Laws. I argue differently. My argument is that both Britain and the United States prefer more political control, but settle for less when faced with opposition. And this opposition can be either domestic or global. Whether you agree with that argument or not, it can be discussed, but the main mechanism of control through which informal empire is established, I say, is establishing stable subservience in peripheral countries. So whatever the motives, the main mechanism is wanting both stability and subservience in the peripheral country, because that creates the condition for an open economic access and then taking economic advantage of the peripheral country. And the last sort of point I will mention at the beginning, which emerges from juxtaposing types of imperialism, is that in the 20th century, or now into the 21st century, informal empire has become more and more difficult. Why? Here I juxtapose 19th and 20th century conditions, especially on the global periphery. And the biggest change over the 2 centuries is how authority is organized in peripheral countries. So in the 19th century, most developing countries, what we now call developing countries, had vertical authority structures. But those Maharajas and the Sultans and the Pashas and the tribal chiefs, they're gone. They are the ones who allowed, sort of, if you like, the establishment of informal empire. They could be sort of brought into a ruling arrangement, given some crumbs of that arrangement, and that enabled sort of informal empire to exist, because these intermediate vertical authority figures in turn were able to control the people below them and deliver it, if you like, to imperial powers. Those authority structures have vanished and have been replaced by mass politics in the 20th century as we move into 21st century. So the basic cement that allowed informal empire to exist has vanished. We don't have those intermediate authority figures. So now the Americans look for middle class, hoping that the middle class in Iraq will deliver Iraq. But now Iraq is full of mass politics, and you can't control that as readily. These are highly fragmented authority structures in which informal imperialism becomes more and more difficult. So the ambitions of last century continue, but the material to play with has altered fundamentally. And so you're going to get a lot more challenges when effort to establish informal empire emerges. In any case, those are my opening comments. I look forward to your suggestions, discussions, challenges, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. So we should be back in without my screen being shared. I would now invite Rani to pose the first question to Professor Kohli. Rani, floor is yours.
Thank you, Diego. So I just wanted to share that this is what this fantastic book looks like, the physical copy, and it is indeed over 500 pages. But I'm curious, before we get into the substance at all, what drove you to write this book? What was the motivation behind it?
You know, books in the end are very personal things, in the sense that it took 10 years to write it. And over the 10 years, you spend enormous amount of time in this study that is in your background. This is where I sit, and I wrote it for about 10 years. So you have to have something really driving you to want to do it. Very briefly, I think what triggered this book was American intervention in Iraq. It upset me deeply when US got in there, and as the evidence started coming out, there were just lies and lies on which those intervention was justified, about nuclear, about weapons of mass destruction, etc., which were never found. And those lies reminded me of lies of Nixon and Kissinger during Vietnam years. So I had come to political maturity as Vietnam War was declining. And I had a very personal connection with Vietnam. I felt deeply offended and upset throughout my adult political life about Vietnam. And then I saw the same thing happening in Iraq. So I saw strong parallels. Of course, there were differences at a deep level, but there were also strong parallels. And that all sort of got to me, if you like. I was, just as a biographical note, I was brought up in a family which had participated in Indian nationalist movement. So anti-imperialism was there in the DNA, so to speak. And then that got overlaid with Vietnam and Iraq. So in a sense, this book was meant to be written by somebody like me, because it's very biographical in that sense. So that's what drove me to write it for 10 years.
Thank you. Let's go a little bit more deep in the book. And as you mentioned in your opening comments, you focus on imperialism as, and you define it as both full-scale colonization, a la India, and as well as informal imperialism, or the ability of the imperial power to limit the sovereignty of the client state. But at the, if you wish, theoretical level, where do we draw the line that needs to be crossed for a country to be defined imperialist? Has Syria been an imperial power towards Lebanon, or is Australia an imperial power in Papua New Guinea, or Iran with Iraq, or Saudi Arabia with Yemen, or India with Nepal? In general, a lot of countries in the global periphery do have imperial behavior towards less powerful countries. And this is what perhaps international relations is all about. So where do we draw the line? Aren't most countries imperialist in a sense or the other?
Yeah, that's a good question, Diego. Scholars, as you know, have struggled with that issue of trying to define where is the boundary between just ordinary influence of big power on little power, and when does that become imperialistic. I think I'll make 2 points, one analytical and one normative. The analytical point is there's clearly a gray area in the middle where it is difficult to judge whether a relationship ought to be called imperialistic or not, just strictly on an analytical ground. For example, US relationship with Iraq is imperialistic. US relationship with India is not. Those are clearer cases. In between, there are a variety of, sort of issues, US and Central America, should that be considered imperialistic or not? So there's not going to be hard and fast sort of judgment on that gray area. I think what helped me was an intentional use of coercion aimed at seeking advantage is what allowed me to sort of separate out cases which were cases of mere economic dependency or a fairly typical situation of asymmetry of power, as you said in the study of international relations, where a bigger power, sort of influences smaller power. That's just normal, that big powers influence small power. I shy away from characterizing that as imperialism. I also shy away from calling simply economic penetration of one country to another as imperialistic. So it's not dependency analysis in that sense. But once sort of coercion is used, so when Britain opens up China, we are the Opium Wars, that becomes informal empire. When United States uses enormous amount of economic coercion through multilateral institutions to mold economic policies of Latin America during the debt crisis in 1980s, 1990s, that becomes something much closer to informal empire. So coercion, either military or economic, is a very important component of the definition. But keep in mind, sort of, we are people writing about live issues, so normative issues are extremely important. So to call Syria imperialist vis-a-vis Lebanon, it may well be analytically correct, but it's not that satisfying. It's to call the big powers who seek glory as champions of humanity, calling them imperialists is a lot more significant because they are violating the norms that they champion. And in that sense, the word imperialism has a pejorative, negative connotation. And when you use it, it has to have both analytical and normative bite to be significant.
Great.
Thank you.
So I have a question about sovereignty as being key to imperialism and to inclusive development. You state that sovereignty is a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for sustained and inclusive development. Yet, I want to turn to a case study, which was also a case study in your previous book, South Korea, a country where one could argue that its economic takeoff happens, in the 80s, when it was arguably part of the informal American empire. So I'm curious, how do you explain the Korean state and its development?
You're certainly correct in suggesting that South Korea was a client state. It was kept afloat due to American security umbrella. There's simply no question about it. But when you look at the case closely, especially after Park Chung-hee comes to power in Korea in the 60s, after Syngman Rhee, the US really bifurcates security and economic issues. The relationship is mainly a security relationship in which United States provides guarantees sort of against communist infiltration, either from China or from Soviet Union. But then it lets Park Chung-hee do whatever he wants in the economic realm, as long as he can industrialize the country rapidly and build up its national security. So for all practical purposes, Korea had tremendous economic sovereignty, while it was a dependent state when it came to military issues. So in a functional sense, it fits the definition of sovereignty, because Park Chung-hee was championing a Japanese type of model of development, which the United States had no use for, and yet they just put up with it. He was creating an economic planning board. US would have preferred a much more open market model, and he was tilting towards, an enormous number of state enterprises, which was certainly not American design. So the US tolerated his pursuit of economic nationalism as long as it provided precondition to keep communism away. So I think functionally the case fits with my intuition. And I don't think I'm just forcing that fit, because I had studied that in some detail at an earlier time. And when I was writing this book, I did not think that the case contradicted the evidence.
If I could just follow up with that. In your previous book, State-Directed Development, you argued that the legacy of Japanese colonialism in Korea, brutal as it was, also set up key institutions and mechanisms such as a competent bureaucracy, etc., which were key to Korea's post-independence growth miracle. My question is about Japanese imperialism. Was it fundamentally different from British and American imperialism, at least as far as its longer term impact was concerned. And also if you could mention its motivations and mechanisms there. But basically, another follow-up question on the Korean case and Japanese imperialism, was it any different from British and American?
You know, I don't think Japan's motives were that different. They sought to brutally exploit, you know, Korea and Taiwan. And in that sense, you know, Japan was sort of very much copying British imperialism. They fancied themselves in that mold. The difference, I think, comes from the fact, at least in the case of Korea, is that Japan, in the end, had hoped to incorporate Korea as permanently as part of Japan. And that made a huge difference in terms of how much industrialization they undertook in Korea. So in a sense, the case is comparable to the way US incorporated, say, Puerto Rico, you know, and Puerto Rico becomes one of the few Caribbean islands, you know, which is relatively prosperous by now, or even the way Britain incorporated Ireland. So it's not so much that other imperialists did not have similar goals in some colonies. Korea happened to be a place which Japan had hoped to incorporate, and therefore they started industrializing it as the war zone from which they will launch attacks on China. And hence they ended up creating enormous industrial infrastructure, which is quite atypical for usual colonies.
To me again, one of the arguments of your book is that, and you also mentioned this in your opening comments, is that full-scale colonialism is more detrimental to a country's future economic development as compared to informal imperialism. But yet some of the historical evidence that you present in the book seems to contradict another point that you make, which is the point that where the colonial power left behind a relatively well-functioning and centralized state, like in India, for example, developmental outcomes were better. And here the contrast with Nigeria, which is also one of the cases of the book, is quite illuminating. Nigeria was certainly less colonized than India was, both in terms of number of years and as well as in terms of the penetration of the colonial state. But one of the consequences of this absence of a functioning state in Nigeria was that development was severely constrained after independence. And the case of Korea that Rani just mentioned also would suggest the same. And even if you think of Pakistan and India, in Pakistan, the presence of the colonial state was much less pervasive in many ways. So all these seems to suggest that more colonialism is better for economic development. How would you explain this?
Well, that's a good provocative question. I don't think there is a contradiction. I think instead of thinking more versus less colonialism, when you're comparing, say, India or Nigeria, you should think of varieties of colonialism. It's type of colonialism that's differing. It's very hard to have a scale in which you can say India was colonized more and Nigeria was colonized less, except for the obvious thing that colonialism in India was 2 centuries and in Nigeria it was 60 years. You know, short of that, what is less colonial about Nigeria than India? I think it's difference in type of colonialism. The British simply did not create state structure because they did not need it the same way they needed a straight state structure in the 19th century Indian context, first to collect revenues, then to use Indian army to go conquer left, right, and center, including Singapore, where you guys are situated, And in that sense, I think it makes more sense to think about types of colonialism if you're comparing within the category of colonialism. But when you get into formal versus informal empire, there we are talking about fairly clear distinction between degrees of control. Because in informal countries, you do have autonomous rulers who have to be paid some sort of bribe to do the bidding of the imperial power. And in that bribe lies, if you like, some possibility of doing development, which is a little better than in full colonialism. So across types of empires, say formal versus informal, we can talk about sort of degree of colonialism. Within colonialism, I don't think you should try to compare too easily that Nigeria is less colonized, Korea is more colonized, India in between. I think those are types of colonialism. I would not think of them as more or less colonial. And so I think I would be careful with that language.
Rani, to you.
Thank you. Perhaps we can turn to contemporary applications of your book. I think one of the issues of today is that we see is the rise of China. And my question is really about whether coercion needs to equal hard power, right? Hard power display in order for it to be qualified as empire building. You state that coercion is key to establishing an informal empire. But do you really have to display hard power in order for it to be coercion? Could, for example, Chinese engagement in Sri Lanka, where debt equity swap led Sri Lankans to sell part of their crown jewels, Hambantota Port and Port City Colombo in particular, on 99-year lease agreements to China, could that not be characterized as coercion? What about China's rising influence in organizations such as WHO, the World Health Organization? We're seeing that in the newspapers almost every day, this back and forth between the US and WHO and China. Or the newly created development banks, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank. In other words, would you characterize Chinese engagement in the Indo-Pacific today as the early stages of imperialism?
No, that's a great question, Rani. As you know, the book ends precisely with a discussion of that issue. So for the audience, if you're interested, I do have a brief discussion on it, but it's pretty inconclusive. The short answer is we don't have enough historical evidence right now to answer that in any strong ways. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about those issues, and the book does try to think, and I'm continuously thinking and evolving my answer on that as the reality changes. I think I take economic coercion very seriously. That is why the whole discussion on Washington Consensus, which is in the last part of the book, is not about military coercion, it's about economic coercion. And in that sense, I use the word coercion as an umbrella category within which both military and economic tools can be brought to bear to exercise influence. And in that sense, if I was to be consistent, Chinese pressure on Sri Lanka very much resembles what US was doing to Latin America during the debt crisis. And I do single out China's influence on Sri Lanka in exchange of port cities and the port as pretty close to informal empire as historically we know it. Because it's a singular case, one doesn't want to characterize China as building an informal empire as yet. China is certainly creating economic dependency, but I distinguish creating economic dependency or exercise of great power influence from informal empire. China has lent a lot of money to these countries. New York Times story 2 days back wonders, will China simply lose out all this money because these countries won't pay back, and it's not obvious what tools they have. What do they want in Ethiopia, which will pay back umpteen billions they might have lent, and they may not have a similar set of arrangements that the US had in Latin America to ensure that the money gets paid back in the 1990s. Whether Chinese will use military tools to ensure that their debts get paid back, if they do, then indeed we're in a new era of economic imperialism. My best guess is the Chinese will not go in that direction, not because they're a superior thinking power, it's because American power will deter them. And that's simply great power politics in a fairly conventional sense. The situation reminds me of 19th century when the United States shied away from military intervention in Latin America because Britain was still very much present as a great power. And so it kept growing its economic influence, and it became a military power only after the Spanish-American War in Latin America. So throughout 19th century, there was great power conflict in Latin America with Britain having the upper hand, and that deterred the United States. The US kept talking about Monroe Doctrine, but Monroe Doctrine didn't have any teeth because they didn't have a navy to go with it. So they kept talking about Monroe Doctrine, but they didn't have steel ships. And the steel ships only come into being, which then give them very effective power, first to defeat Spain, and then Britain being, sort of clever people, they realized their time was over. And from there on, military power becomes consequential. I think the parallel now is the Chinese are clever thinkers. They recognize their military power is much inferior to the United States. And in key places, they will shy away from military intervention as a tool for seeking economic benefits. So I don't think we will get the classic type of informal imperialism, but with Trump promising to pull out of various parts of the world, if that becomes the new American doctrine, a new type of isolationism, then that might open up the possibilities for the Chinese to actually use military power. That still awaits in the near future. So I think Chinese expansionism is best thought of as creating economic dependency, but not moving into building of an informal empire in the 19th and 20th century senses.
Back to me for our last question on our part. So if you in the audience have any question you would like to ask Professor Kohli, please use the chat function and Kartik will collect them and ask them on your behalf. So my last question is that one of the arguments of your book is that imperialism is not a mistake, and that yes, sometimes things go wrong, like for the Americans in Vietnam, but by and large, imperial powers benefit greatly from having an empire. So could one draw the conclusion that a country like India is essentially doing the right thing in increasing significantly military spending, as this will allow it with time to establish, if not an informal empire, at least a sphere of heavy influence on the economic policies of other countries, and this in turn will promote its national economic interest and prosperity?
I study India quite a bit, and I wish I could attribute such forward thinking to their decision makers, but I can't. I think India's defense expenditures are mainly defensive in the sense that they're afraid of China. And finally, it's dawning on them that there's trouble ahead. The thinking has not been all that coherent. India has not had a grand strategy, which it should have had, in terms of dealing with growing political conflict in the region. I don't think it has been systematically thought through that if their military power increases, vis-a-vis some of the smaller countries, they may benefit economically. They're already a giant power vis-a-vis a Nepal or a Sri Lanka, and they're not able to use that in any constructive sense of, sort of getting economic benefits too much out of those countries. China has moved much more sharply in that direction compared to India. Some of it is resource imbalance, some of it is just strategic, sort of lack of sort of strategic coordination and thinking on part of some of Indian decision makers. I don't want to be too harsh, but my sense is the defense expenditure growth in India is aimed much more at China, and in that sense is defensive rather than forward-looking in terms of trying to build informal empire in the region.
Thank you. So Kartik, I would now hand it over to you, and you will ask questions on behalf of the audience.
Diego, Ronnie, thank you for that wide-ranging, insightful discussion on an important book, and we are indebted to Professor Kohli for writing it and for speaking with us about it. We are now going to move to the audience Q&A, and for those that have submitted questions via the chat function, thank you. I will curate and organize these questions and ask Professor Kohli to respond. As Professor Kohli mentioned, the book is divided into 3 themes: the motives that drive imperialism, the mechanisms through which formal and informal imperial rule is established, and the impacts of colonialism. And as far as possible, I have and I will try to club audience questions under these 3 themes. But before I move to the 3 themes, Professor Kohli, I want to ask one broad question. Since you have read across different literatures and disciplines for this book, have interviewed many people and are deeply aware of contemporary political and economic developments, and have yourself written about different kinds of Asian imperialisms in your earlier seminal book. Your latest book is the addition to a series of focused books on American and British imperialism that include How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr, American Empire by A.G. Hopkins, A Theory of Imperialism by Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik, and John Wilson's Chaos of Empire on British imperialism. In your view, what accounts for the scholarly resurgence in studying empire?
It's a good question, Karthik. I'm not sure I have a real answer, but there does seem to come a time when a number of scholars, quite not even connected to each other, end up asking similar questions and discussing why and that happens. Rani, you speak German. What's the German word? Zeitgeist? Right?
Yeah.
Go ahead. How do you pronounce that?
Zeitgeist. Yeah. It's difficult to translate, right? The main questions of an era.
Yeah. And so in that sense, it is a moment to rethink that. And I think the biggest change, Karthik, that helps us understand that, I think, is the end of Cold War. I think the Cold War involved us in thinking that everything was sort of communism versus capitalism. And so many of the struggles could be interpreted through those set of glasses. the end of Cold War sort of has made us think of history differently. Now the Cold War looks like an interregnum, something which might have been an exceptional period. And for the United States, early 20th century and post-Cold War put the Cold War in a different context. So what the US was doing in the early 20th century, when it's expanding into Cuba and to Philippines, now has parallels with what it's doing in Iraq. And that puts Vietnam in a very different light. That puts intervention in Chile and Iran in very different light. So suddenly thinking that US was intervening in Chile or Iran or Vietnam as a result of a fight with communism, people now think, no, this is more like imperialism. This is 20th century imperialism. So I think the post-Cold War has helped create a global mindset in which people are rethinking empire. So relationships among great powers may still continue to be viewed fruitfully through a realpolitik type of set of glasses. But the relationship of advanced industrial countries with poor countries now make less and less sense when viewed through the realpolitik sort of left, right, communist versus capitalist sort of type of glasses. And therefore there's a resurgence of interest on category of empire. And so I think the world is, variety of scholars are rethinking and reimagining how do we think of North-South relations. So the global South, how it fits into the world structures of domination, I think has now forced us to bring back imperial categories.
Right. So the first theme of the book focuses on a key question. Why do powerful, hegemonic, capitalist states imperialize? And the first question deals with these motives. And the book's argument is that the motive of imperialism is the pursuit of national economic interest. Dominant states pursue economic prosperity, and political control over lesser states is a key way to achieve that. At the same time, considerations besides those that are purely economic could also enter the picture. Geopolitical factors could have influenced the expansion of the United States and Great Britain in the developing world. Your economic argument runs against the grain here, since most analyses, particularly in the US case, was that American interventions were driven by the need to deter communism in the context of a Cold War. Now, many scholars claim that American credibility was at stake if it did not intervene in Vietnam. So how do you disentangle the economic motives from the political and geopolitical considerations that many scholars claim drove American interventions during the Cold War?
You know, I was already getting at that in my last comment to your earlier question. I think when the Cold War was dominant and it was on, so to speak, it was very difficult to disentangle the impact of Cold War from other motives. So variety of scholars who were trying to challenge the dominant paradigm, and the dominant paradigm of the period was clearly that US was intervening for realpolitik reasons. So that was clearly the dominant perspective. It was hard for scholars to challenge that. Anybody who challenged that was called revisionist scholar. So historiography or variety of scholars for basically left-leaning scholars who said, this is not realpolitik, this is really sort of a type of neo-imperialism. Those voices were marginalized during that era because the evidence in and of itself of that period was not sufficient to disentangle one set of causes from another set of causes. I think that's why the end of Cold War has shed real light on what might have been driving it. So if US is intervening in Iraq, that puts US intervention in Chile and Iran in a different light. You know, now there is no communism to fight. So either we say, well, US intervened against Mossadegh for a whole different set of reasons, and then US intervened against Saddam for a whole different reasons. That's a type of causal epistemology I don't buy. I think you have to find a causal pattern across incidents, which sort of has some shared commonality. So I think in that sense, now the case that US intervened against Mossadegh for realpolitik reason looks very weak. It almost seems silly, that was the main reason, or the reason US deposed, Allende in Chile was because of Soviet threat. Give me a break. Now the evidence just does not hold up. During an earlier era, a Kissinger's voice here or there could still make it, half decently tenable. I think in the post-Cold War era, those arguments seem a lot flimsier than the hegemonic paradigm of that time period allowed.
Right. So the second theme of the book focuses on the mechanisms through which imperialism manifests, or the varieties of imperial formation which you classify as formal and informal. And you argue that the main difference between formal and informal empire is the degree of control exercised by the metropolitan country. So the second question deals with the timing of colonial conquest. How the United Kingdom or the United States engaged in formal or informal imperialism in the 19th and 20th century hinged on their capacity to secure elite cooperation, or in your words, stable subservience, which in turn was determined by whether peripheral countries had centralized rule. You point out that formal empires often bred the conditions for formal empires. How integral is the question of timing to formal versus informal empire building?
It's pretty important, especially one of the points that briefly I touched upon in my presentation was the change in the nature of politics in peripheral countries between 19th and 20th century. In 20th century, we really get the emergence of plebiscitarian or mass politics across the world, especially in the post-Second World War period with the emergence of mass nationalism. Once nationalism emerges, and as Ben Anderson taught everybody, that nationalism is sort of horizontal politics. It usually leads to dissolving vertical authority structures. So the sultans and the maharajas and the pashas, and the tribal chiefs, their authority gets undermined with the rise of nationalism. So the later we are in the imperial era, so in the later 20th and early 21st century, the building blocks of informal empire have weakened. And so those figures who could deliver the political energy of poor countries to metropolitan elites don't exist anymore. They are readily challenged by nationalist competitors. So every time you find a lackey in a third world country who's willing to deliver their country to an imperial power, there's an alternate opposition leader who will mobilize masses very quickly on a nationalist platform. And that creates enormous difficulty for establishing stable subservience. And therefore, I think the 21st century, the lesson for would-be imperialists, whether it's US or China, or even if India has some such petty desires, is this is not going to be the same game as the British played with sultans.
Right. We have a really interesting question tied to British imperialism. Tied to British imperialism. How did British imperialism differ from other contemporary colonialisms? Example, the Dutch and French, etc. And do you agree that the British left a legacy, rule of law, institutions, which other colonialisms did not?
That's a good question. There's enormous variety even within British colonialism. The British left behind a relatively well-functioning state in India, but did a horrible job in large parts of Africa, not to mention the Palestine, so they left a mess in other parts. So I don't think they should be exonerated as, sort of the better imperialists. There's enormous variation within British experience. Were the French or Dutch worse? I don't think those comparisons hold up that well. It is the case that the British had a better political acumen in judging when opposition forces were emerging in periphery and made concessions. The Dutch were truly blind to that, and so were the French. So the French pushed all possible oppositional politics, say in Vietnam, into sort of marginal and underground places. That left only Ho Chi Minh as a potential alternative, because they had killed off equivalents of Gandhis and Nehrus, in Vietnam. They had a similar pattern in Algeria. So there was a type of political blindness in French colonialism to allow reformist opposition to emerge, and in that sense had much more difficulty in allowing sort of possible democratic politics to emerge. The British had a better sensibility on that. It doesn't mean they didn't put Gandhi into jail. It doesn't mean they didn't put Nehru into jail. They kept trying and trying and trying not to give India independence as long as they didn't have to. But when they had to, they did. They didn't wait for an armed battle, which then defeats, the French in 1954 in Dien Bien Phu, So in that sense, there is a difference. But the difference is not better imperialists, that they left institutions. There's enormous variation. It is that the British were politically more astute and knew when to get out. And the French did not. They dug their heels in till they lost, first in Algeria and then in Vietnam.
Right. So the final theme of the book focuses on the impact of imperialism on peripheral countries. We have a few interesting questions here on that theme. The first is, did British and American imperialism influence the creation of a hydrocarbon empire in the Middle East?
I don't understand the question.
So did British and American imperialism influence the creation of petrocarbon states in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others, who dominate international politics through oil?
Well, some of the, petrostates have clearly been a product of imperial era, to the extent that the Ottoman Empire was broken up at the end, late 19th, early 20th century, as part of ongoing European influence in that part of the country. And then that results in emergence of number of protectorates and malformed states, some of which find oil. In that sense, the connection between poorly constructed states in the aftermath of dissolution of the Ottoman Empire and emergence of oil kingdoms is intimately related. So Iraq and Saudi Arabia would be very much part of that. However, Iran is not. another important oil producer, and Iran is an old sovereign sort of state with an old civilization and its own boundaries. The West has intervened periodically. So I don't think one should overgeneralize, but it is the case that Saudi Arabia remains a client petrostate. It was a product of one type of imperialism, now is supported by another type of imperialism. Same with Iraq. And in that sense, Western interest in Middle East in the end is rooted in oil. I don't have any doubt about that. Sort of, as somebody said, if all they had sand, you think we would be there?
So next, I want to ask you to reflect on the enormous developmental consequences of British geographic engineering. India and Pakistan, Israel and Palestine, North and South Nigeria, a lot of different parts in Africa and the Middle East. Large parts of the developing world remain engulfed in conflicts that originated from the divide and rule strategies of the British, or through the drawing of borders that did not take into consideration ground realities. The ensuing conflicts not only had enormous human and social costs, but it also diverted resources towards resolving wars and conflicts that could have been used for development. Do you see British geographical engineering as an important legacy of imperialism, British imperialism?
The simple answer is yes. Of course, the states that resulted from imperial era were poorly formed boundaries, variety of ethnicities thrown in, and that has been a foundation of less than effective states, and in that sense, that has hurt development. So that much is pretty obvious. But, and I'm no friend of imperialism, as you can tell by this book, but it is the case that one should not put all the blame of that on imperialism. Just think of history of state making in Europe itself, how prolonged and ugly and malformed it was. It has taken a couple of world wars to sort out state boundaries and, sort of, in a sense, the whole process of state making is an ugly process. And it was no gentler, even in Europe, without imperialism. So when Prussia conquers tribes in rest of Germany, will Alsace be part of France or will be part of Germany? They were still fighting about it after 2 world wars. Russia's boundaries with Poland and other sort of Ukraine and etc. has still continued, in afterwards. So ethnicity and state making are not easy processes. They were pretty messy in Europe. They have barely settled. And those processes in developing countries are certainly a product of imperial history. But one should keep in mind, had there not been a British Empire, had there not been a French Empire, will states in Africa be much better? I have my doubts.
Right. I want to now move to the policy implications of the book and connect the book to recent developments. Your findings have a lot to say of current events that have to do with China, Iran, Iraq, and the state of the international order. And we have a few questions that focus. In the book, you argue that multilateral pressure is one vector through which the United States established its global influence and informal empire. Now the multilateral system is and has been in crisis, failing to manage great power conflicts that mark our current era, which means that methods of informal empire today, building through multilateralism, will change and evolve. Now, one potential way this is happening is through the export of US laws that countries have to internalize themselves to retain access to the American market. Does the export of US laws and regulatory standards in areas like environment, labor, technology, through bilateral and multilateral trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership qualify as a new variant of imperialism, given America's pronounced loss of faith over the current multilateral system?
I don't think so. I think if we start including all such international influences as imperialistic, the concept becomes too loose. It becomes a polemical tool for criticizing certain types of US policies one may not approve of. But analytically, it's not a very sort of sophisticated use of the concept. I would shy away from spread of bilateral influence among unequal powers, sort of as imperialism, until and unless there is a use of coercion and it's aimed at securing long-term economic benefits. I think one should be careful. Otherwise, loose categories just create confusion. It can be satisfying emotionally. Oh, this is imperialistic. But, and some of that I'm also doing. So I don't want to sort of totally claim high ground. But it is also important to be analytically tight in moral condemnation.
Right. So you might have come across some of the latest theoretical and empirical innovations in the field of international political economy that have to do with the concept of weaponized interdependence. Does globalization and economic interdependence enhance America's ability to imperialize today, given their unique position and coercive control over global economic networks and patterns of trade and investment? So in other words, is weaponized interdependence a euphemism or a sanitized way of saying informal empire?
What empirical cases do you have in mind? Or whoever is asking that question, is this about Saudi Arabia? Is that a weaponized interdependence?
So this directly relates to the sanctions against Iran and how the United States was able to use and leverage the international financial system against Iran. And that's one big case which scholars of weaponized interdependence have used to demonstrate their argument.
Yeah, I think the United States would certainly like to have informal imperial control over Iran, but they're not always that successful. Iran is a fairly significant sovereign state in its own right. It is under pressure, and sanctions indeed are costing it dearly. Whether that constitutes informal empire, I think it's probably best to think of as an attempt to create an informal empire. It's far from achieved. It is best to think of it as a big power trying to badger a little power, having forgotten their own history of intervention in that part of the world. Thinking about US-Iran relations is extremely interesting. I'm just going to take a minute to sort of expand on that idea because I have a whole case study of Iran in the book. And so many Americans forget their own history. United States had very little to do with Iran prior to World War II. And it was only after that they got involved. And then they got involved very quickly because the British were losing sort of their sway on Iran because they were becoming less of a global power after World War II. And as their influence was diminishing, the United States stepped in a big way and wanted to stop the nationalization of British petroleum in Iran. And that's what led to the Mossadegh Coup. And it was that coup that set up in an important way the rest of history of US-Iranian relations. Sort of that it's a bit of an exaggeration because not everything in life is path dependent, but the whole current US-Iranian relationship does not make sense without the intervention against Mossadegh, which then led to US, sort of putting in a client Shah Iran, which existed in Iran for umpteen years, decades, and the anger that created in Iranian society against sort of the Shah as well as the United States, then that led to these not very liberal mullahs who also are not terrific set of rulers. And so what we get is one bad deed leading to another bad deed, leading to another bad deed. And here we are. So I don't think US relationship is as successfully imperial as it was during the Shah of Iran. They would love to get back there. That's why they want change of regime of the Ayatollahs. They're probably not going to get it because that's part of emergence of mass politics. People like Shah have vanished. Now you have plebiscitarian politics in modern Iran, and it's not going to be easy to have sort of client rulers. So the US will keep trying and badgering till somewhat more moderate regime emerges in Iran that is willing to work with the US.
Right. I want to return to the question of China again, and its role in the multilateral system today and how it's using the multilateral system to its own advantage. Given the US's growing disinterest to and within the multilateral system, the role of China and its interest in global governance has increased. It has contributed to the creation of several new institutions, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank. China is also, according to some accounts, the largest bilateral and regional development donor to most developing countries, which creates a relationship of dependency with those countries. Is this increasing dependency of some developing countries on China a sign of the global shift in the balance of power? And is foreign aid that China is deploying in the 21st century a key tool for informal empire building?
I wouldn't say foreign aid, but finance. I think finance has become a key in terms of establishing influence when it comes to economic influence. So it's less foreign aid, it's more lending of money for projects, and then an inability of Pakistan or Sri Lanka, now it's sort of Ethiopia, to pay back that money. That then creates preconditions for emergence of informal imperial relationships. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that China's expansionism becomes competitive with Western expansionism, and in that sense gives the more savvy developing countries more room to maneuver. Like during the Cold War, there was more room for non-aligned countries to take advantage of both the Soviet Union and the United States. With the decline of Soviet Union, there was about 10 to 20 years unipower world, and we got the Washington Consensus, and we got the debt crisis, and Latin America paid a heavy price. Now Latin America is able to both borrow from China and export commodities to China. That diversifies Latin America's dependence on sort of away from United States to also China. And in my way of thinking, diversified dependence is less dependence. And in that sense, yes, China creates new dependencies, but it is also opening up room for maneuver if you are a sensible developing countries. If you are really run by third-rate folks and are sort of really ineffective states, then through bribery, this and that, leaders can be bought, or brought into an orbit of influence, which might be detrimental to long-term prospects of development for that country. But Latin American states are relatively sophisticated, and they, for example, have become also, it's sort of part of Chinese orbit, especially when it comes to trade, but also borrowing, little less on borrowing, but especially on trade and trade-related investment. And there's a very good new book on that by Barbara Stallings, which suggests that, yes, dependency is growing. But I think that dependency is healthier because Latin America was always dependent. It was mainly dependent on the US, a bit on Europe. Now it's also diversifying into China. And in that sense, that creates a little more space.
If I can intrude with some sort of follow-up question, you mentioned foreign aid, which is something that I would have thought it would have been included in the mechanisms for establishing an informal empire after World War II. Why wasn't it there?
In my book?
Yes.
It's sort of there, in the sense, if I go back to the case Ronnie had brought up before about Korea, foreign aid is a major mechanism of creating sort of at least the security-client relationship. In the modern, in late 20th century, foreign aid's role has declined. Finance has become so much bigger that countries can raise private funds, which are quite substantial if they have, medium to sort of bigger sized economies. If you're really small African countries, foreign aid is still extremely important, especially official aid. But for a country like India or, sort of Brazil, the game has changed. Sort of foreign aid is not where it's at. You can go to private equity markets and raise 10 times the amount by floating bonds. And so whether your need is foreign exchange or, other types of foreign resources, many more avenues are now available. So foreign aid is not as substantial a tool, but it should not be ignored, especially for smaller countries, and especially when you're sort of studying the past in which foreign aid, such as in Korea, played a very important role in establishing client relationships.
Professor Kohli, speaking of finance, I don't know if you talk about this in the book, but what role does the dollar as the global currency play in facilitating America's global dominance?
Pretty important role, sort of, if you go back for a moment to OPEC raising prices into the 1970s, was a critical moment. Had a country like Saudi Arabia not decided to keep all its surplus export earnings in dollars, it would have cost the United States dearly. The US and Saudi Arabia reached an implicit, some say it was explicit, sort of agreement to keep all the international sort of excess liquidity coming from enhanced petroleum prices after OPEC in dollars. Those then became, sort of the Euro banks, the sort of uncontrolled resources that were available to developing countries that then led to the debt crisis, which then led to the Washington Consensus. So in a sense, the primacy of dollar, which might have declined at that time because, that was Nixon's concern. It was sort of the declining importance of dollar in the sort of after Vietnam War especially, the US had spent so much that it had become a creditor country, and it might have hurt the capacity of US to maintain bases, to spend dollars, and sort of that. So dollar has always been an integral part of American hegemony that could have been challenged in the post-OPEC period. But because Saudi Arabia and some of the others were client states, they all decided to keep excess resources in dollar. That in turn sort of helped the United States perpetuate its financial hegemony. And as the US economy became more and more financialized, that became more significant. So yes, the answer to your question is yes, that's an important resource.
So we have one last question before we wrap up. You mentioned it took you a decade to write this book. What was the hardest part of writing this book and the most satisfying part of writing this book?
Thank you for asking that. The hardest part, intellectually speaking, was to reconcile or to deal with Cold War arguments about why US intervened with my own framework. That took a fair amount of intellectual stretching, which usually in the pre-COVID area used to be go sit in a coffee shop and think and think and think, or take long walks. All that is history now, you know. But yes, so the hardest part were the intellectual parts where the argument did not fit readily. The British argument came more easily, US was harder. And in that sense, it was an intellectual struggle. The most satisfying part, you know, occasionally through the mess you were working with, suddenly an insight would come and you would say, bingo, that's what I was struggling with. And the satisfaction of that, only scholars understand. You know, sort of all of us who write know that feeling of, you know, sort of a type of epiphany that comes about 5 times while you're writing a book. And those 5 are priceless moments. So in 10 years, if I had 4 or 5 of those moments, that was worth it. So.
All right. I think, yes, it's time to wrap up. Thank you so much, Professor Kohli, for discussing your last book with us, which, let me remind you, is called Imperialism and the Developing World, How Britain and the United States Shaped the Global Periphery, by Oxford University Press. It's a great book. Buy it and read it and think about it. I guess that's everything for today from the Institute of South Asian Studies here at the National University of Singapore. And thank you also to the audience for contributing to grilling Professor Kohli for an hour and a half. Thank you so much, all of you, and see you the next time.
Thank you.